What's up, guys? This is Jan for Chess24. We take one final look back at the Tata Steel Masters in Holland and review the last round encounter between World Champion Magnus Carlsen and his challenger Sergey Karjakin. Some of you might remember the two of them played a match against each other. When was it? 2 months ago in New York? 6-6. Carlsen won the tiebreak. Hope that wasn't a spoiler. Anyway, this is not only the rematch for that World Championship match, but it's also an encounter with a bit of relevance for the tournament, because going into this game, Magnus Carlsen is half a point behind Wesley. So if Wesley were not to win his game and Carlsen would win this one, he could still claim tournament victory. Wesley played with the black pieces against Jan Nepomniachtchi. Carlsen with white against Karjakin goes for 1e4, tried all kinds of things in the match, but in general, in the match, Carlsen showed no particular inclination to test the mainline Berlin. And don't you worry, this game is no exception. In this game, Carlsen goes for the trendy, what do we call it? Italian, I think. For now we call it Italian. The move bishop c4. This has been gotten more and more popular at the highest level, mainly because people don't enjoy playing the Berlin. Bishop c4, Karjakin goes bishop c5. This is more popular than knight f6 because knight f6 allows the extra option knight g5 with a very sharp game. And why bother? So bishop c5, the main line at the highest level, and here the move order subtleties already start. For years, c3, knight f6, d3, as Carlsen plays in this game, has been the absolute main line and played on autopilot. But recently, after castles, black has been doing quite okay with the line castles d5, as far as I can tell. This has been played quite a bit with decent results for black. Therefore, a lot of players on the white side try to avoid that line with some move order subtlety, like they start with castles, knight f6, d3, and now after castles they don't go c3, but they play a move like a4, and all of a sudden things get a little different again. But not in this game. Carlsen goes for c3, knight f6, d3, castles, but does not castle here, allowing d5. Instead plays a favorite of his, and I don't necessarily mean in this position, but just in general, the move bishop to g5. I remember an old New in Chess article by Anish Giri, where Anish mentioned every top player has their specialty / weakness, and Magnus's is the love he has for the move bishop g5 in these Ruy Lopez Italian structures. And here he goes again, plays bishop to g5. Some of you might remember this position, because in the New York match in game 10, when Carlsen was down by 1 and had to win, he played this line. And you can see the only difference is here the bishop is on b5, not on c4. In that game, Karjakin reacted with bishop e7, followed by d6, equalized out of the opening, but then went on to lose. And maybe that's what stopped him from using the same maneuver this time around. Because after bishop g5, if black has not played d6 yet, it is quite established that the correct reaction is, with or without h6, to go bishop to e7, unpin, then play d6, then knight to h5, with an equal position, which is exactly what happened in the match game, as I mentioned, with the bishop on b5. But this time around, Karjakin does not feel like unpinning. Maybe he thought Carlsen likes these structures too much, maybe he felt like playing more sharply, but he goes for d6 here, which is a rare combination to play d6 and short castles, because in order to get rid of this pin, you have to go h6 followed by g5. It's true that in many positions this works quite well, but normally that is in positions where white has already castled kingside, and here he hasn't yet, and Carlsen is not in a hurry to do so, plays knight bd2 first. Karjakin plays h6, bishop h4, and this pin is annoying, so he does go for the immediate g5, which typically, let's say, here, if white had castle, instead of playing knight bd2, often you get this, if white castles earlier with these move order subtleties, blah blah. Typically this, after bishop g3, knight h5, or a later knight h5, is quite playable for black. But in the position on the board, h6, bishop h4, g5, white is not forced to go bishop to g3, but instead the piece sacrifice, knight takes g5, is extremely strong. Which, once again, is well known. I keep jumping back and forth between this with castles instead of knight bd2. I hope I'm not confusing you too much. Here, knight takes g5, hg, bishop g5 is not supposed to really work, because, or it's not supposed to be dangerous, because black is in time to defend. He goes king g7, after queen f3. Typically, played to keep this pin alive, you can defend by different means. Rook to h8 is a typical, do I say typical a lot? I have a feeling I do, is a good move intending to, for example, play king to g6, target this bishop, and after h4, black is in time to unpin here with bishop to g4. Bishop takes f6, queen d7, little trick, queen g3, king f6, and black is doing extremely well. Not a forced line, what I'm trying to say is after castles, h6 and g5 works quite well. Well, after knight b2, h6 and g5 doesn't work so well because of this piece sacrifice, which Carlsen blitzed out. Knight takes, pawn takes, bishop takes. White only has 2 pawns for the piece, but he has a long-lasting initiative because of the exposed black king and this pin, which is very, very hard to break. And the topic of the next couple moves will be, will black be able to break this pin so he can move his queen around? Start with king g7 to reinforce this, and white goes queen f3, making sure you can't untangle here so easily. The plan I showed you earlier after short castles does not work so well here. Black goes rook h8, for example, white just goes h4, and after king g6, black is nowhere near in time to get this bishop g4 in. Knight f1, intending knight to g3, or knight to e3 is very strong. Bishop g4, let's say. Queen g3 is big trouble for black in this version. So black is in trouble. I'm sure Karjakin realized that. Caruana, who is playing in Gibraltar at the same time, the world number 2, tweeted somewhere around here that Karjakin must be feeling very charitable to allow this position. Something has clearly gone wrong in the opening for Sergey Karjakin. But he does have a bit of fame as a very tenacious defender, and he is not just going to roll over. He plays the move bishop e6, and believe it or not, black's main idea now is to play knight b8 followed by knight bd7. Bring some reinforcements so that you can finally move your queen out of the way and unpin. White has a wide choice in this position. Bunch of interesting moves. I really like the move knight to f1, which I believe Carlsen did not play because of a little tactic. It's not bishop c4 that bothers him, because here after knight g3, white just wins. But there is a tactic, bishop takes f2. Point being that after queen takes f2, black goes knight takes e4. Apparently losing all his pieces, but not really. This is just a way to simplify the position. After d takes e4, queen takes g5. Black gave his piece back, but he unpinned himself and is active enough to at least maintain the balance. So this would be a dream situation for black. King takes f2, knight takes e4 is even worse. d queen g5. But I said I like it, and the reason I do is that white has the very strong move king to e2 here, just ignoring this bishop, saying, you know what, my initiative is still strong. I might even be able to use this f-file you just opened for me. And after bishop b6, knight g3, black is still in for a pretty difficult defense. Even though things aren't so easy, you have to keep an eye out on this bishop g4 idea. So Carlsen decided against this knight f1 move and played b4, bishop b6, and now an interesting positional idea. He goes for bishop to d5. This is directed against the maneuver I mentioned earlier, against knight b8, knight bd7, because after knight b8, there is now bishop takes b7 winning material. You could argue, and the computer does, that white should not have played b4, but gone for bishop d5 immediately, because then it's going to be a little easier for him to castle queenside later on without having weakened this position. And the white initiative is still extremely strong, a very, very unpleasant position for black. After b4, as played in the game, bishop b6, bishop d5, Karjakin seizes the best chance. He goes a5, creating a little square for his rook on a7. And after b5, he plays knight to b8, once again intending to unpin, as the arrows tell you. White does have a choice, but it's very logical, having embarked on this mission to grab the pawn, take on b7. Now, making sure he more or less establishes material balance again. White now has 3 pawns for the piece. Rook a7 is forced, and in this position, Carlsen, in my opinion, commits a mistake. He goes back with the bishop to d5, but that allows black to conclude his maneuver and finally bring reinforcement to the poor knight. That could have been avoided by playing bishop to c6, just fighting for the d7 square. If black now plays knight bd7, white doesn't have to, but could very much take on d7. Black has to recapture with the bishop, and once again, this pin is here to stay. A sample line, by no means forced, but to show you how bad black's position is, would be to play knight c4. If black grabs this pawn, white just goes h4, tending h5, h6, h7, rook h6, and wins. For example, takes, rook e8, h5, rook e6. Try to reinforce the f6 knight, h6, king h8, h7, and there is no defense against rook h6, and white wins the game. Of course, not forced, and I don't think this would have happened, but bishop c6 would have posed black grave problems, because there is just no breaking this pin. Instead, bishop d5 was played, knight bd7, and now all of a sudden black is ready to take, move his queen out of the way. This is what happens, knight c4 takes, queen to e8, and the position becomes, in my opinion, completely unclear. White does have 3 pawns for the piece, and still a bit of an initiative, but the pawns themselves, they're not ready to form a passed pawn and create a queen or anything like that. It's just a complex middle game, and there the number of pieces do matter. Black will move his knight out of the way, his king out of the way. I don't know, the computer still slightly prefers white. My gut feeling is that I'd rather be black here, because the extra piece is so important now that all black pieces function normally. Knight to e3 played, heading for f5, rook to g8, castles, and knight h7. King will find a reasonably safe home on the h8 square. Knight f5, of course, this is a beautiful knight for white. It's not all bad. King h8, bishop h4. But the worst is over for black for now. Still, it's a highly complex situation. Karjakin goes rook a8. This rook wasn't doing anything on a7, so it's planning in the distant future to get transferred to the king side. Carlsen also improves his position, goes rook ae1, hinting at rook e4 or d4. And that's where we get f6, very logical. Opening this diagonal for the queen, maybe preparing knight to g5, and rook e4, discouraging knight g5 at least, because now white would take rook g5, rook h4 check, when his attack would regain momentum, not what black wants. Instead, knight c5 was played, questioning what this rook was doing there, and the rook goes one step back to e3. This contains a little trap, because after queen takes b5, grabbing the pawn, white has a petite combinaison that wins on the spot. Very nice trick. Bishop takes f6 check, knight takes f6, and knight to d4. Discovered attack against the knight on f6. After e takes d4, white checkmates. Queen f6, rook g7, rook e7, rook g8, queen h6, rook h7, and game over. Of course, Karjakin does not fall for this. Instead, after knight c5, rook e3, he retreats with the knight. Maybe a silent draw offer, maybe not, I'm not sure. But white could repeat moves with rook to e4. Carlsen has no such intentions, instead continues the fight with d4. Has to be said that somewhere around here, Wesley So had either already won his game or had a completely winning position against Jan Nepomniachtchi. So tournament victory was no longer available for Magnus Carlsen, but he still continues to fight for the full point, probably not in the best of moods, not just because his position has deteriorated, but also because he does no longer have a chance to win that tournament, since Nepomniachtchi went down against Wesley So without much of a fight with the white pieces. d4 played, queen to g6 by Karjakin. An interesting decision, returning material in order to simplify to an endgame, which wasn't necessary. The computer is not a big fan. The computer says just go knight df8, keep amassing pieces on the king side, and you'll be alright. Or, well, he evaluates it as roughly equal, but I kind of like queen g6 as a practical decision. Getting rid of this powerful knight on f5 and simplifying the issue. Knight e7 has to be played, queen g4, knight g8, rook g8. Now white is up a bit of material, theoretically speaking. He has a rook, and if my count is correct, 3 pawns against 2 knights. But his bishop is kind of bad on h4, the pawn on d4 will probably fall, and rook and 2 pawns against 2 knights is not really a material advantage. So long story short, I think this position is still roughly equal. Queen takes, rook takes, Carlsen goes g3. You could make an argument for bishop g3 as well, but the bishop will be passive either way, and Carlsen thinks on g3. On h4 at least, it targets the f6 pawn. Karjakin after g3 decides to take the pawn on d4 directly, regaining a pawn but opening the e file for the rook. Compi says it's also fine to just keep the structure locked up. Go knight h8 with, complicated play. g3, ed, cd, bishop takes d4. Rook e8, rook g8. Rook e7, rook g7. Maybe another silent draw offer. White could repeat again with rook e7, rook g7, but Carlsen has no such intentions. Instead, decides to keep both rooks on the board, goes rook back to e4, tending to fight for the e-file. Not even fight for it, to just occupy it. Karjakin decides to not make it so easy for white to enter along the e-file and goes for a little trick here, knight to e5. However, this knight won't stay on e5 forever, and maybe it was better to just go bishop to b6. Maintain the status quo. The point of knight e5 is rook takes d4, knight f3 check, but the problem is white goes king g2, parrying that threat, and after bishop to b6, f4 chases the knight away from its nice square on e5. Knight to g6, threatening knight takes h4, and here the computer points out a somewhat surprising solution that, according to him, gives white an advantage. Rook e8 check, rook g8, takes, king takes. This is quite logical. Often if you have two rooks versus one rook and minor pieces, you want to exchange one of the rooks so your other rook can roam more freely. That's not really the case here though. The computer set says white just goes f5, fixes things, gives up the e5 square, knight e5, rook f4, and it's very hard for black to ever do anything active. Well, white has ways to improve his position, g4, a4, get the bishop out of the way, h4, and white is better. Who am I to argue? It's a surprising plan. It doesn't look like much, but maybe this was the way for Carlsen to keep winning chances intact. Instead, in the time trouble, this is move 37, he plays a natural king h3, keeping an eye on h4. Karjakin rightly brings his king to the center to defend some squares. King g8, rook fe1, king f7. This situation is now dynamically equal again. Rook to e6, keeping an eye on f6. Rook to g8. And here Carlsen, on move 40, the last move before the time control, does commit a mistake. It was best to do nothing more or less, maintain the status quo, play a4, when neither side can improve their position all that much. But Carlsen goes rook 1 e4, probably just thinking he's making a neutral move, and then in order to think after the time control, but rook 1 e4 gives black a chance to improve his position dramatically. And Karjakin takes that chance. He plays f5 with tempo, attacking this rook. The rook has to go back, rook e2. And the big point here, and the move that Karjakin does spot, is rook to h8, keeping white sort of tied up, because now you can no longer play bishop g5, since this would be a check. That's the point of rook h8. While you have to worry about ways for black to improve his position. As for white, it's not clear how he can ever improve his. Carlsen goes a4, and Karjakin plays a third very strong move in a row, the move king to g7. The point of king g7 is that it prepares knight to f6. You can't start with knight f6 because rook f6 would be check, winning. But after king g7, let's say white makes a neutral move, rook e1, then knight f6 is crushing. Here, after rook takes f6, no longer check, knight takes h4, pretty much wins the game. This rook is hanging, and all the black pieces become too active. While if you don't take, let's say rook d1, black goes knight e4, and all his pieces start operating at full capacity. All of a sudden, the white position is completely hopeless. Too many threats. Knight f2, bishop f2, knight h4, maybe rook h4, knight c3. White just collapses with the black pieces so active. So Carlsen, of course, realized what he had done after king g7, and kudos to him, he does find the most stubborn defense, which is to give up an exchange and hope for the best, pretty much. Rook takes g6, you have to eliminate this strong knight. King takes g6. Now black is a piece up for 2 pawns, again, one has to say, but in an endgame this time, and only black can be better. But things aren't so easy because the black forces are still a bit passive. Here after rook e6, the strongest way to play was the move king to h5, which was not played in the game. The point is that black can afford to even lose his f-pawn and still remain in the driver's seat. For example, king g2, knight f8, rook f6, knight d7, rook f5, king g6, let's say rook g5, king f7. Now black has consolidated, and it will be his turn to do business next. Knight c5, knight takes a4. The white 3 passed pawns aren't really fast enough, so this position is very, very good for black. Karjakin plays a more natural move, plays king to f7, not willing to part with the f5 pawn. Rook e7 check. He still had the chance to go back to h5, king g6, followed by king h5. But instead, he goes passive. He goes to the back rank with king g8, keeping his pawn, but now it's going to be very hard to untangle his pieces. And Carlsen understands that he can now create more or less a fortress where it's going to be hard for black to get out. King g2, knight f8 has to be played, tending rook h7 to fight against this. Bishop to g5, just sidestepping any knight g6, knight h4, rook h7, and rook to e8. Now it's key for white to keep the rooks on the board. And it turns out black can't really free his position. Let's say king f7, then just rook to d8. And there's nothing that black can really do to improve. This happened in the game, and the king just went back with a little threat. If white carelessly plays h4 now, then black would go rook d7, rook e8, king f7, and his pieces would start to breathe again. Knight g6, knight e7 is coming. But that can be avoided by just repeating moves. And that's what Carlsen does, goes rook e8. You can try for yourself, there's no real way to improve the position here. Rook f7, was this played? Yeah, I believe rook f7 was played, threatening king g7 once again, trying to get out. But bishop h6 just keeps black pretty tied up. Rook to f6, bishop back to g5. Just nothing to do. Rook g6, white would go bishop e7. Therefore, the rook went back to f7. And after bishop h6, the players agreed to a draw. Hard-fought game between the two World Championship contestants, which, yeah, had many surprising moments. First of all, Karjakin's opening treatment, that he didn't go for bishop e7 or h6, bishop e7. Instead, after d6, knight bd2, allowed this extremely dangerous piece sacrifice. Then Carlsen, yeah, maybe he missed some chance. Maybe bishop d5 immediately was stronger, but the big one for me was after rook a7, that he didn't play bishop c6 to keep this pin alive. And since he didn't do that, the game became very double-edged, roughly equal, I would guess. Karjakin simplified to this endgame, which he, yeah, then played well. Carlsen missed maybe this f5 chance, I'm not sure, the rook e8 f5 chance. And on move 40 with rook 1 e4, allowed black a chance to even be better. However, Carlsen then went on to defend stubbornly and make the draw. Maybe that should have been the video, just the last minute, summing it up way more concisively. Is that a word? Anyway, the tournament ended with a Wesley So victory. Congratulations to him, winning 3 super tournaments in a row. Carlsen had to settle for second place, 1 full point behind Wesley So. Won't be very happy, and Sergey Karjakin on 7 out of 13. Later went on to tweet that he was very unhappy about his Wijk performance and still felt very tired from the World Championship match. I'm very tired from the Wijk coverage, so thank you guys for watching this video and see you soon. Bye bye.